Hi, my name's Marion. I'm here from SDL. It's great to see so many people I know here and some new faces. So today I just wanted to have a look at some of the considerations we need to look at for the multilingual web. Many people have touched on them already, and I have a feeling they're going to come up time and time again. So we're going to look at how many languages. So how do you decide how many languages you want your website into? And is translation really as simple as translation? And how do we keep pace with developments? And what happens to our content as the technology changes, because it's moving at such a rapid pace? How do we keep up with it? So how many languages? You'd be surprised how many people still come to us and hand us a website that was written in English and never intended to be published, and then they've suddenly realized there are a lot more people out there than just English speakers. So we touched on some of this morning. So you can see Wikipedia has 287 languages. Facebook have in and around 80, Microsoft 59, down to the UN. Fernando has 6 languages, and the World Customs Organization has 3. So how many languages is too many? How many should we be looking at, and how do we make that decision? And ultimately, the number of languages should affect your website design from the very start. So we heard from Fernando that if you write a website in English, sometimes you have Arabic problems. Richard was talking earlier about text not displaying properly and you having to put in spaces, and all that needs to be considered, but people, they don't think about it. 2.4 billion people use the internet now. That's a lot of people in a lot of languages. And we have this one graph that I thought was really interesting. So you can see on the left-hand side here, the content of the information on the web versus the users of the information on the web. And we can see here that the content is predominantly in English. But when you look at the users, only about a quarter of them speak English. And then if you look at the Chinese, only about 4% of the content written in Chinese, but a lot more of the Chinese people use the web. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing companies creating content and institutions creating content, not taking into consideration who's using it and who's reading it, and really what they should be putting their information into. And I could spend, maybe not we, but I could spend quite a long time on this graph because I find it really interesting. But we'll move along. It's something, these slides will be available. It's something for people to look at and people to consider when you're making a website, when you're disseminating information. Who do you want it to go to, and what do they speak? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much you write if nobody reads it or nobody's able to read it. So translation's simple, right? We talked about it here today. Translation must be simple. Machines can do it, can they? Well, there's 2 schools of thought. We have translation and localization. So what, should we just get out our, in my case, an English-Irish dictionary and take it word by word and translate it literally and hope for the best? Or should we give it to people that know what they're doing? And I've got a few examples of where translation was done and they haven't taken the localization into account. You've probably seen some of these before. Ford had a fairly substantial problem selling one of their cars in Brazil when they called it the Pinto. And after quite a lot of customer feedback, they changed the name, and they were a little bit more successful once they changed the name. Coors famously have a saying called "turn it loose," but when they directly translated it literally into Spanish, it was read as "suffer from diarrhea." So surprisingly enough, Coors wasn't really selling in Spain. So, you need to be very careful. And then when Kentucky Fried Chicken, who has, a slogan that they've had for years, finger licking good, they didn't take into account the way Chinese translate things, and it turned out it's eat your fingers off. I do eat Kentucky Fried Chicken, but I do try to have my fingers intact by the time we're finished. And one of the last ones, in Italy, Schweppes tonic water translated their brand name into Schweppes toilet water. So it's not simple. We all think, oh yeah, it's just a few words, it doesn't make a big difference, we'll just give it to the first person we meet that speaks that language. But we have to be really careful, and this is what we wanted to highlight, the difference of translation and localization. There are a lot more of these examples. Some of them are far too rude. to put up on a screen in front of the audience, but it just gives you an idea that you can't just translate something. You have to take the cultural sensitivities into account. So good localization is not cheap, and I put good in brackets because you can get cheap localization. Some of it is good, some of it's not good, but if you want it to be really good, unfortunately you have to pay for it. And some of the things that you need to have a look at is, are your resources in the country where the information will be required? Speaking to a few people at lunch, and we were talking about how quickly the languages change. One of the people were saying somebody they knew went back to Russia after 12 years and it sounded like they were speaking a different language because the language had moved on so much that the language they learned growing up was totally different to the language there now. So your resources should be in that country so that when the changes take place, they are up to date with the changes. Famously, about 8 years ago, I think it was, German decided to change all their spelling rules, and that created havoc in the industry because everybody had been translating it the old way, and all of a sudden that wasn't valid anymore. So you need the people to be in country. And in some countries that's okay, but in other countries that makes it a bit more expensive. Resources should translate then with the local market and the cultures in mind, because we talked about it here earlier, words in English mean certain things in English, but when you put them into another culture, they mean something completely different. So if I was to say the word boot, most people from Europe are going to think of a shoe, but all the Americans here are going to think I'm talking about something else. And a trunk in the US is a boot of a car in UK. So you have to take into account that words that we take for granted here mean one thing, somewhere else means something, sometimes something funny, and sometimes something that will make all your clients just run for the hills. And then terminology. It's very important, and people tend to think of it last. But what you should think about it, think of it first, define what it means, then translate it so that when you do start getting the rest of your material together, the word will be the same the whole way through. I know several companies that have sent something out, maybe a manual, 300 pages, and they've sent it out to 3 different people, and they end up with the one thing being referred to as 3 different things in the manual, and it can be quite confusing. So terminology, we feel, is quite important, and you need to consider it as well. So the next thing, once we've managed to get all the pesky language problems out of the way, how do we keep pace with developments? So it used to be really easy. There's some fine examples of it in the hallways if anyone has taken a look at some of the displays outside. I had one of these machines in 1983, and it wasn't until 2006 that we had what we now recognise as the standard laptop. And then after that, look what happens. It goes a bit mad. So, you know, we have the laptop, we think we're doing really great, and all of a sudden we have smartphones, we have tablets, we have smart TVs. We go from Microsoft IE being the main browser to having over 40 browsers now for different devices. They're all different sizes. They're changing practically on a daily basis. And what do? Do we change all our websites every time a new device comes out? How do we get that information out to people? And as the industry is developing and they're all trying to be the next company to launch the next big device, how do we keep up with it? Because we're always going to be behind, because they're going to launch first and we're going to have to keep up. So this is one of the things that we've been looking at. People are really impatient. We were talking about it earlier. How long is an attention span? Believe it or not, I've been informed that humans now have an attention span that is worse than goldfish. So half of your users, if your site doesn't load in 3 seconds, they'll just go away and they won't come back. 80% of them will tell people that your website doesn't work. And that's depending on the device that they launch it on. So this is quite important. So if 50% of the people can't get the information they want in 3 seconds or less, they're just going to go find it somewhere else. So what are we looking at? One size doesn't fit everything anymore. We mentioned devices, the way they change. This is an example of a website. On the left, it's what you get if you launch it from a PC or a laptop. It's very nice, it's very neat, it's got all the information you like. On the right-hand side, see what happens when you launch it from a mobile phone. everything gets squished and everything gets elongated. And as a user, I would be very frustrated if I had to scroll down and down and down to get to the information we want. So I've got 2 examples here. So this is the Porsche website. We call it contextually poor. You can see just about their branding. It's very hard to see. It's very diluted. The pictures, they're high resolution pictures. They're lovely pictures. I like the pictures. If anybody would like to buy me a Porsche, come talk to me later. But what you have is you have the same pictures on the main website as the ones on your mobile website. And that sounds great because you want everybody to have the same experience, but the problem is downloading a 3 meg picture when you're on Wi-Fi, it's no problem, because when you're on Wi-Fi, you're connected constantly. On your mobile has to go off to the server and go, hey, Mr. Server, I want to get some information, and the server kind of has to wake up like a grumpy teenager and go, what do you want? And then your mobile has to go, I want this picture, please, and the server goes, oh, if you have to have it. And then you have to start downloading it. And if you're on GPRS, that can take forever. So you need to look at ways of getting that information to people faster. So this is another example. It's a Lexus website. I'm not obsessed with cars, but again, if anybody would like to buy me a Lexus, you can see here that the website's different. It looks different on the mobile device. The navigation is different, and that's to make the experience for the user easier. The branding is clear on both sites. Although it's a smaller screen, you can still clearly see the branding. The phone also has different pictures. So you've got the big, lovely, shiny picture on your website, and then on your phone, it's not a bad picture, it's just not a high resolution picture, so it's easier to download. And then also what happens, you can see the website has picked up the fact that the phone has a GPS, and it's changed the page accordingly and given the users options that people on a mobile device look for more than they look for on the web. So how do you do that? Not magic. We call it omni-channel delivery, and this is what happens. You write your content once, and we call it intelligent content. So you write your main content, and you give it tags, and you tell it this is for this device, this is for another device. And then we have a piece of software that does intelligent analytics. So when somebody asks your website for information, it detects what kind of device you're on, what kind of screen you have. Is it a big screen? Is it a small screen? Is it a touch screen? It also decides if you have GPS capabilities or not. And then it gives you the website you need on that device at that time. So you don't have to write 15 websites, one for each of the major devices in the market. You just have to tell the system what the devices are, and it decides what information to give to the person. So that's all nice and lovely. That's how we do it today, and that's brilliant. But what happens now? This is a quote from Forrester. They do a lot of the analytics, and they do a lot of forward thinking, and they reckon that the development of devices is just going to explode in the next while. So what does the next generation of interface look like? Could be anything. We don't know. What does that mean for us? That means that we have to try and keep up. We have to try and squash our content into different size devices and different formats, which also means the price will go up, which also means it's more complicated. So who is responsible for that? Is it us? Is it the device manufacturers? Who gets to bear the cost of this new magic device that's going to be invented tomorrow? And that's a little bit of food for thought. I'm going to rush through the summary because this is going to beep any minute now, and it's quite loud, as you might have heard. So we have a couple of considerations. We have a lot of language considerations. Our content, how many languages, what's your target market, how do you want to present it? And then we've got our devices and channels. Is it going on the web? Is it going through the mobile? You know, I've seen in the room today, we have laptops, we have iPads, we have smartphones, and that's just in this room. I don't know if you've been to China recently, but they're even worse. They seem to have technical gadgets coming out their ears. So we need to consider that. And one thing that we need to have a look at is it enough for us to define the standards for the web and everything else? Or do we need to sit down with the device manufacturers and say, look, we know you want to break the next big thing, we know you want to make loads of money, but you have to take into account that every time you change the size of your device or your screen or your format, that everybody else has to pay the price. So with 2 seconds to spare, that's me.
Thank you.